And in terms of the translation, the language of the Qur'an, the language he uses, it's very old. It's very old English language. And it's, because he's a missionary, it's biblical language. Often he's used biblical terms in his translation. So for example, in Surah Yusuf, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the blessing that he's given Yusuf of being able to interpret dreams, وَيُعَلِّمُكَ مِن تَأْوِيلِ الْأَحَادِيثِ, that he will give you the gift of interpreting dreams. Rodwell translates it, and he will teach thee the interpretation of dark sayings. The interpretation of dark sayings. Now the term dark saying, even though in today's language it sounds very ominous, in his time it was actually a biblical phrase used to mean interpretation of dreams. Yeah, and it's used in the Psalms in this sense. In the Psalms of the Bible it's used in this sense, dark sayings to mean interpretation of the dreams. So Rodwell in his translation throughout is actually using biblical language and very old English language to obviously, and therefore it's very difficult to read. The translation has actually been revised, and it's been revised by a contemporary person, and this is actually the revised translation by a person called Alan Jones, who also has his own translation which we're going to talk about later on. Now Alan Jones is an Orientalist, and he's taught Arabic for 43 years at the University of Oxford and University of Cambridge. And his expertise is early Islamic literature and pre-Islamic poetry, and we'll talk about that inshallah him later on.
Explain the word
Orientalist is a non-Muslim Western person who's come to study Islam. Okay, often with ulterior motives, i.e. with a Christian or missionary background, and sometimes, rarely, without ulterior motives, just as an academic study. So Orientalists are academics really studying Islam from a Western non-Muslim perspective.
Any reason why that word is used?
Because the word, why is the reason the word Orientalist used? Because when the science or discipline first started, the Muslim word was called the Oriental. Yeah, and it was referred to in the world as the Oriental. And therefore the Orientalist is somebody who makes a study of the religions of that particular area. So Alan Jones, in his revision, he revised the translation, and he's revised or pruned, as he says, some of the footnotes. And actually, to be honest, I like Old English, and I actually like this translation as it stands at the moment with the revision. It's a very nice translation. If you like Old English, it's a nice translation. It's accurate, it's got a few inconsistencies, a few mistakes, but the main problem still with this translation is the notes. The notes are, from our point of view, of course, blasphemous and really contrived. He's trying his best to find contradictions and mistakes and inconsistencies in the Qur'an. The next translation we have is by Palmer, again a Christian, and this was in 1880, and this is the translation of his. And he just called it the Qur'an. And out of all the translations done, this is the first one done by a non-Muslim where he shows respect to the Qur'an. It's more of an academic endeavor as opposed to an Oriental polemic endeavor. And he's actually shown respect to the text of the Qur'an and talked about the sublime language of the Qur'an as well. And what he's done to make the Qur'an easier to read is he's paragraphed it. So instead of like a verse-by-verse translation, one verse and the next verse, he's put it in paragraphs. So like paragraph 1 would start from verse 1 to 10, the next 10 to 30 or whatever. And he's made it, put it into paragraphs to make it easier to read, and it does actually make it easier to read. Again, the translation is pretty good. There are some problems with the notes, and because he's put it in paragraphs, it's generally easier to read. The first Muslim effort of translation in the Quran is by Marmaduke Pickthall. This Quran here, which I just read the introduction from. In 1930. and he was a British Muslim, a revert or convert to Islam. And it's the only translation that I know of that's gained the official Azhar stamp of approval. And when he was translating, he would actually go to the Shaykh of Azhar in his translation and ask for help whenever he got to difficult passages in the Qur'an. So he would actually go to a recognized scholarly body, a scholarly figure, and ask him what the meaning of certain verses were, which he had difficulty in translating. And it is a very nice translation. I like it a lot. It's a very nice translation. The problem with it, again, it's being done in 1930, is the Old English. So if a person finds Old English hard to understand or follow, then he'll find this translation very difficult to follow. But in terms of accuracy, it's very accurate. And in terms of just readability, as I said, if you like Old English, it's very readable. And it gives a nice sense to when you're reading the Quran. It gives a nice sense to the feeling to the experience of reading the Quran in English. The next translation, the famous translation, which I'm sure all of us know, is a Yusuf Ali translation, which is this one here, parallel Arabic and English text. It was originally done, most of us might remember the original one, which was in a white cover and with some gold. And that was the original translation of Yusuf Ali. It had lots of mistakes, and the footnotes were problematic. They were quite modernistic and liberalist and liberal in some places. This translation we have now is actually, it was revised by the Saudi authorities, and many of the mistakes were pruned, and many of the footnotes were pruned as well. And again, it's a very nice translation. Most of us will have grown up with this translation. Again, it's in Old English, and if you like Old English, then this is a translation really that's it's nice to read. He wasn't an expert in Arabic language, and he based his translation very heavily on an earlier Qadiani translation into English in Pakistan, or out of Pakistan, by Muhammad Ali, which was done in Lahore in 1916. There's another translation by Shakir, which is also very popular. And the translation you download off the internet, for example, for an iPhone or whatever, that translation is actually the Shakir translation. And that translation is actually, they said, was a complete plagiarism of this Qadiani translation in 1916. I haven't actually seen that or read it in any detail, so I don't know. But it's accused of being, or blamed for being just a basic plagiarism of that translation. And it has many problems in it as a result. The next, again, this is a non-Muslim translation, was in 1937 by Richard Bell. And again, what he did, he tried to copy Rodwell. He tried to arrange the Quran in what he thought was the order in which the surahs were revealed. So he tried to rearrange it, and generally he did a better job than Rodwell. But again, it just didn't work, and he was criticized for that as well. And again, his aim in translating the Quran was to show the alterations and substitutions and arrangements in the Quran. So again, it's a missionary work. Moving on, we have the translation by Arbery in 1955, which is this one here. Arbery's translation in 1955. The Quran interpreted a translation. And this is generally viewed to be one of the better translations of the Quran in the English language. And in his introduction, he states that the Quran ranks amongst the greatest literary masterpieces of mankind. So he's recognizing the beauty of the Quran. And he says in his translation, he says, I've called my version an interpretation. He was the first person to actually call his translation an interpretation rather than a translation. And he said, the reason why I've called it an interpretation is because I have to concede to the fact that the Quran, like other literary masterpieces, is untranslatable. You can't translate it. And he says in his conclusion, I pray that this interpretation, poor echo though it is of the glorious original, may instruct, please, and in some degree inspire those who read it. So yes, it is a good and accurate translation. And what he's done is he's left it purely at translation. There are no footnotes. There are no endnotes. There are no brackets with explanatory notes inside. There's nothing at all. It's just literally a straight translation. And it's ironic that he's calling it an interpretation, but out of all the translations, his is actually the most like a translation rather than an interpretation, because he's not put any of his own interpretation in it, or he's tried to keep the interpretation to a minimum. So there's, as I said, no brackets, no footnotes or anything.